The First World War was a war of trenches, diplomatic escalation, and new technologies, but it was also a conflict where all participating countries sought after a fair price in the event of victory. During the early stages of the war, the Entente and the Central Powers fought each other on multiple fronts, each trying to break through the lines of their enemies. Each and any of these states were trying to achieve some sort of goal by winning the war. And we are going to concentrate on the territorial ones, since we will talk about what lands each major country in the First World War wanted in the final peace treaty. The first country we'll look at is Germany. Germany entered the conflict only days after it started, and had already prepared itself to the possibility of war. It was in the midst of rising tensions between itself and the British Empire, due to the naval arms race that had been going on between the two empires for more than 2 decades. On land, its biggest rival was the Russian Empire, that German military commanders were afraid of, due to the fear of it surpassing Germany's military capabilities in the future, thanks to its slow but steady industrialization. In the west, Germany bordered the French Republic, that had been opposed to German influence over Europe since the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. German territorial ambitions in the war started out very ambitious with the September Program, a plan created by Private Secretary Kurz Reisler in the starting years of the war. This plan included seizing much of Western Russia and dividing it into puppet states of Germany, creating new kingdoms like Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, while also re-establishing the Kingdom of Poland and uniting the Baltic territories into a united Baltic Duchy, led by Baltic Germans. In the west, Germany wanted to make Belgium a puppet state, more than a simple buffer, similar to a client state. This would also include a land exchange with it, which would see Germany annexing some parts of eastern Belgium, such as Antwerp, in exchange for Belgium gaining the French region of Picardy. In fact, Germany also wanted to reconfirm their control over the recently annexed Alsace-Lorraine by expanding it into French territory. Germany would also make sure to annex Luxembourg. Although this was the extent of their desires regarding Europe, Germany also envisioned a solid expansion of their colonial empire, especially the parts of it that were found in Africa. It was proposed in case of victory that Germany would annex the Belgian and French Congos, as well as Equatorial Africa and Gabon, therefore uniting the colonies of Cameroon and German East Africa via land, forming a new and larger colony called Mittelafrika. With time, the extent of Germany's plans changed, especially after its initial defeats on the Western Front. First of all, while originally Germany used propaganda to make the Poles in the Russian Empire rise against the Russians with promises of creating a Polish kingdom, after high amounts of losses that Germany had to suffer to make gains in the east, many in the military desired for greater direct territorial expansion in the east, prompting Erich Ludendorff, a German high commander, to consider the annexation of large parts of the Polish lands promised to the new Polish kingdom. Then came Chancellor von Bethmann-Hollweg, who saw the September Program as too devastating for the balance of power in Europe, and therefore to be revised and limited. He thought that the best way to go was to make a less punishing treaty with the Russians, taking only Poland, Lithuania and the Baltic territories from them, while on the west he wanted to bargain with the King of Belgium a separate peace with less devastating effects on the country. As the plans for Europe became milder, so did the ones for Africa. In Africa, Germany was performing well only in the East Africa front, fighting with guerrilla tactics and defending the colony almost up to the end of the war. This made it so that some German strategists abandoned the idea of Mittelafrika, instead wanting to concentrate on East Africa, making the annexation of British East Africa and parts of Mozambique and Congo seem more plausible. Despite all their desires for expansion in the war, the Germans were not as successful as they had wished to be, making all their plans for a territorial expansion crumble following the Treaty of Versailles. Only the lands Germany had envisioned to take from Russia through the September Program were momentarily gained through the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, a separate peace deal with the Russians in 1918 that would only last 8 months. The next country we will focus on is Russia. Russia was on the opposite team of Germany. In fact, Russia had joined the Entente thanks to its alliance with France. The Russians saw themselves not as attackers, but as protectors of the Serbian people, and did not consider the declaration of war an invasion of their enemies. This is why their territorial victory goals in the war were way more limited than those of the Germans, despite both countries pouring immense quantities of men and money into the war. The Russians initially only fought against the Germans and the Austrians, with debatable amounts of success. While against the Austro-Hungarians, the Russians managed to push into their lands and occupy much of the territories of Galicia-Lodomeria, the same couldn't be said for Germany. After an initial advance into German East Prussia in the first year of the war, the Germans quickly gained the upper hand, leaving the Russians in a state of costly and continuous retreat into their core lands, losing the entirety of Poland and Lithuania by 1915. In this phase of the war, the Russians had plans only for the lands that border some of their most important regions, such as Ukraine and Poland. In fact, it was proposed by Nikolai Nikolaevich that Russia should do everything possible to unite the Poles under its empire, and that by promising the re-establishment of a separate kingdom of Poland, the Poles would support the Russian Empire's war effort. It was also proposed that, when Russia would win the war, all the lands inhabited by Poles west of Russia would be given to the new Polish kingdom, expanding it greatly. It was still fundamentally a part of Russia though, since such kingdom would be still led by the Emperor of Russia. As for Austria-Hungary, Russia demanded the annexation of all of Galicia-Lodomeria, to unite all the Eastern Slavic populations, called Rus by the Russians, into a single empire. All these plans were changed when the Ottoman Empire, the eternal rival of the Russian Empire, joined the war in late 1914. It was many decades that the Russians had wished for the Ottomans to finally fall under the Russian eagle, and this was finally the best occasion to make them do it, thanks to the help of the French and British. Russia wanted several territories from the Ottomans, especially Constantinople, called Tsargrad by the Russians. Through an agreement with the French and British, Tsargrad was promised to Russia in exchange for its effort against the Ottomans. In addition to this, Russia desired to annex Greater Armenia, expanding their territories into the Anatolian Peninsula. Even so, the Russians would never see any of these plans reach the light of day, as their eastern front collapsed and the population rebelled and ousted the emperor, bringing to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and ending the Russian involvement in the Great War. Next we will be looking at France, one of the major members of the Entente and the sworn enemy of Germany in the war. France had initially joined the war as a means to defend Russia, which it was allied to since 1892, when the two states formed the Russo-French rapprochement. These two powers had been united despite their vastly different governments. In fact, France was a broadly democratic republic, while Russia was an autocratic monarchy. Despite their differences, the two powers had joined forces to defend against a possible invasion from the Germans or Austrians, who had been at odds with them for a long time. When Russia joined the war against Austria-Hungary on the side of Serbia and Germany declared war on Russia, France had no choice but to enter the war on Russia's side, and promptly this resulted in the Germans declaring war against the French. The French, while initially unsure of Germany's strategy in the war, had been desiring a way to get back Alsace-Lorraine for over 40 years. In fact, the main reason for the support for the war in France was the high levels of revanchism regarding a previously mentioned territory, Alsace-Lorraine. This region had been annexed by the German Empire following the Franco-Prussian War, where France received a decisive defeats, being occupied for several years and seeing the German Empire form in Paris through the work of a German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. But as the war went on, French territorial aims in Europe became more ambitious. In 1915, Maurice Barrès reintroduced the concept of France's natural borders, a vision that saw necessary for France's defense in the future the annexation of any German territory on the left bank of the Rhine River. This ambition was discussed further even with the diplomats of the Russian Empire, that, having large-scale ambitions on their own, supported their plan. Differently from the Russians, the British disliked the plan and preferred a more moderated approach to possible French expansion, not wanting to destabilize the balance of power in Europe. Some of our proposals for territorial expansion were theorized by some Frenchmen. These included the annexation of the Sauerland, a coal-filled area of western Germany, or the creation of an international area in the Rhine region of the German Empire that would be occupied by France. The proposals went as far as the complete division of Germany into its constituent subnational monarchies, while neutralizing Prussia by giving large parts of it to the Russian Empire, although this plan was really not approved by any of France's allies. Outside of Europe, France's colonial ambitions were quick to show themselves. When France by 1916 was engaged in combat on multiple fronts, even helping in the attacks against the Ottoman Empire that had joined the war on the side of the Central Powers, France expressed a desire for partitioning the Ottoman Empire, and inside of this partition, it envisioned a French-influenced Syria, Lebanon, and Cilicia. In Africa, French victory aims were clear: the division of the German colonial empire, which meant, more importantly, the annexation or partition of German Cameroon and Togo. Eventually, the French would indeed gain much of their desired territories after the end of the war, but they had to give up most radical options, such as the annexing of the left bank of the Rhine or dividing Germany into multiple states, due to the US's intervention in the peace talks. Now comes the time to talk about Britain, one of the largest powers in this war. The British Empire had been dragged into World War I against its original wishes. In fact, Britain had decided to remain neutral when the declaration of war from both sides fired, but had to intervene when Germany violated the neutrality of Belgium by invading it, since Britain had guaranteed Belgium's independence and neutrality. Britain had close ties with both the German royal family and also had decided to stay out of the original alliance the Russians and the French made before the war, but as the naval arms race and the colonial disputes with the Germans began to rise, the British Crown had stipulated alliances separately with both the French and the Russians by creating the Entente Cordiale in 1904 and the Anglo-Russian Entente in 1907, respectively. When Britain joined the war, it desired no territorial expansion, as its main objective was to re-establish an independent Belgium and return to peace in Europe by neutralizing the German menace and weakening it economically and politically. This changed in 1915 and 1916, after the entry of the Ottoman Empire on the side of Central Powers. The British started expanding their war aims, adding to the war loot the possibility of gaining large sections of the lands of the Ottoman Empire after its imminent partition with the French under this Treaty of Sykes-Picot. But it didn't stop there. In fact, Britain made sure to expand their claims over half of Persia, that would in turn be divided between the British and the Russian empires, despite its neutrality in the war, as a way to completely control the Middle East. The expansion of war aims continued throughout the war, especially under the government of Prime Minister David Lloyd George, that saw the punishment of Germany as a priority in the war. This punishment did not only mean reducing Germany's lands in Europe, but also taking parts of their colonial empire. This was accentuated when, in 1917, it became well known that Britain's victory goals included the partition of Germany's African and Oceanian colonies within itself and Britain's allies. A big part of this colonial expansion included the thoroughly sought-out annexation of German East Africa, a colony that, when attached to British East Africa, would connect Britain's domain in the Dark Continent from the north to the extreme south of it, allowing for the creation of the Cape to Cairo Railway that would later connect almost all of British Africa together. In the end, Britain's territorial ambitions in the war were almost completely achieved. With the end of the war, the British would indeed partition the Ottoman Empire with the French. They would annex much of the German colonial empire, including German East Africa. They would punish Germany and reduce its territory in Europe, and they would even occupy much of Persia, although for a limited amount of time. Next, we will look at the Kingdom of Italy. Italy was originally neutral in the Great War, having proclaimed neutrality in the beginning of the war to avoid being dragged in the conflict on the side of Austria-Hungary and Germany. In fact, Italy had formed the Triple Alliance with these two powers in May of 1882 as a way to get some support in its expansionist and colonial endeavors during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as well as to have a guarantee that they would not go to war against the Austro-Hungarians for the time being. This was much against the wishes of the Italian people, that saw Austria-Hungary as Italy's sworn enemy and rival, due to the multiple wars fought against them to unify Italy and to the long-standing oppression of Italian minorities inside the empire throughout the 19th century. When the war started, Italy used the fact that this war was one of aggression from the Austrian side to stay out of the war, since the Triple Alliance was a defensive pact. As the war raged on, both sides of the war started making proposals to Italy to get them to either remain neutral or to join their side. It is said that the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarians had plans to make the latter give the Italian majority province of Trentino and the city of Trieste to Italy, in order for it to remain neutral in the war. But Austria-Hungary opposed the ceding of Trieste, since it was the empire's main port. On the other hand, the Entente wanted Italy to join directly on their side. This prompted them to offer way more than their Central Power counterparts, which culminated in the Treaty of London in 1915. Said treaty was a secret agreement between Britain, France and Italy that would promise to Italy the lands of Trentino, South Tyrol, Trieste, Istria, Northern Dalmatia, Southern Dalmatian Islands, and finally Valona and Cesena in Albania. The signing of this treaty prompted Italy to join the war in 1915 on the side of the Entente. Yet this was not the complete extent of Italy's territorial ambitions. In fact, while official diplomats were satisfied with the agreements taken in the Treaty of London, many Italian patriots and irredentists saw this not as enough. Some territories that were excluded from this treaty still had Italian majorities, such as the prominent city of Fiume, now called Rijeka, the second largest port of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Others wanted to have complete control of Dalmatia, not wanting to split it with the rising Serbian realm. Some even proposed to extend the annexation of Valona and Cesena in Albania to the entire country, or at least to make it some sort of Italian protectorate, something that Italy would indeed try to establish in the ending phase of the war. Finally came the question of the Ottoman Empire. The Kingdom of Italy had recently, in 1912, gained the Ottoman territories of Libya and the Dodecanese. The latter were annexed with a single purpose: to serve as a launching point for a full-scale invasion and annexation of large parts of Anatolia. This desire to create a colony in Anatolia would be entrenched in the Treaty of London, but promised to let Italy take the region of Antalya in case the Ottoman Empire got partitioned. All of Italy's plans were crushed once the United States joined the war. President Woodrow Wilson's idea on the peace treaties to end the Great War greatly altered what Italy got compared to what it was promised. Secret treaties made before the end of the war were nullified, and the concept of the right of self-determination was preferred for territorial claims over historical motivation. Therefore, only a portion of what Italy was promised in the war was actually given to the Italians after the war ended, which led to the creation of the idea of vittoria mutilata, meaning a limited reward for the immense hardships that Italy had to go through during the war. This fostered a sense of betrayal by the Entente that helped the spread of fascism in Italy, and that was used by the fascists, later on, as a justification for their foreign policy. Well, this is it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed watching and learning about the different territorial ambitions of the major countries during World War I. As you may have noticed, I left out some of the relevant participants in the war, such as the Ottomans or the Austro-Hungarian empires. So let me know if you're interested in learning about their own war aims in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I hope we will see each other next time.